All right, it looks like we have some more people coming in. It's now a couple minutes past 11, so I think I'm going to go ahead and start off with our introduction for today's event, and people can keep joining in the meantime. So welcome to the University of Michigan Press author live talk series. Today we are here to talk with Andrew Bottomley, author of Sound Streams, in conversation with Michelle Helms. Today is July 23rd, 2020. Moving on. So really quickly, just to clarify the Zoom webinar features for anyone who's interested. So we do have audio and video muted for all attendees, so you don't have to worry about a scene or hearing anything. You should be able to see the meeting host on screen. Q&A and chat are both enabled, and you can use the Q&A primarily for sharing questions that you would like to ask the panelists. And the chat you can use for that as well, or to communicate with the panelists if you're having any technical difficulties. And definitely please let us know if you're having any issues. Basically, just recapping what I said, chat is good for discussion. You can click the little icon down below or at the bottom, where it appears for you, and then same with the Q&A icon, and you can choose whether or not you want to ask your question anonymously. We don't mind either way. We'll still answer your question if we can. So a little bit about the event series that we're doing. So we've been doing these every Thursday, give or take, since June, and we're continuing through August. We still have 3 more talks scheduled after this, and this is a time for you to connect with our authors and learn more about their books, and have that chance to, as close as we can, mimic a live event where you get to talk to them and ask questions. We also share a little bit, of course, as part of this event series with our ebook collection. We've been offering actually all of our press titles for free through the end of August, especially the titles included in this talk. So if you go to the chat, there should be a link for where you could read online the book that we're talking about today, Sound Streams. And we really do encourage you to participate as an audience. We really love when you send us in questions, really adds to the presentation. And in case anyone wants to come back to this later, we will have a recording available that you will be sent a link to after the talk today. So to start off, we just like to get a feel for kind of what everyone might be interested in based on their primary role. So we're going to start that poll up for you in just a second, kind of asking you just to identify primarily where you identify yourself. Obviously, we're usually varied, diverse people, but just choose for the intention of this talk, you know, which perspective you're primarily approaching this talk today. So far, we've got a decent amount of our attendees reporting. We've got a majority professor instructors, some librarians, we've seen a couple publishers, and that's about, yeah, everyone more or less that we have in the audience right now. So thank you for sharing that with us. So moving on, so a little bit finally about the University of Michigan Press. So we've been around actually for 90 years. This is our anniversary year. We publish about 100 books a year. We have a very rich title list in the political science categories, performing arts, classics and archaeology, American studies, African studies, Asian studies, and of course, some media studies, as we're kind of covering today. We also have a section of English language teaching titles, and then another title list area under the Great Lakes and our local Michigan region. And we also do a lot of investment in digital scholarship. We are very big proponents of open access primarily. And as I mentioned earlier, all the books that are featured here are part of our ebook collection, which is supported by Fulcrum, which is our unique open source platform that supports new ways of presenting online reading opportunities, including it allows beyond your traditional ebook that you might read on a Kindle. We have really rich multimedia capabilities for our titles on Fulcrum. And this is a service that's available to libraries via Lyrasis. So with that, I'm going to pass on the conversational baton to Michelle Hilms and Andrew Bottomley, who we are all here to listen to today. Thank you so much for joining us, Michelle and Andrew.
Thank you. Yeah. Shall I open up with a question or two for Andrew, and we can go from there? I just want to say Andrew started the work that became Soundstreams as a dissertation at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where I was at the time, and I had the privilege of supervising his dissertation. So I've read it in various versions. And I was not surprised, but very gratified when his dissertation, as was, succeeded in winning the Best Dissertation Award from the Society for Cinema and Media Studies in 2018, which was nice not only for UW-Madison and Andrew, but also for the fact that it was the first dissertation in the field of radio to win the award, SCMS had been oriented only to film, but primarily to visual studies, but with a growing interest in radio and sound. So that seemed like a really important aspect, or just a prospect for the field. And I think since then, as Andrew demonstrates in this book, it's grown. So I wanted to just start by asking Andrew, what brought him to the subject and why he felt that this particular history needed to be written.
Well, thank you, Michelle. So I wanted to, first just say thanks to everyone who's here and who's joining the talk today, and to Sean and Teresa and all the folks at University of Michigan Press, also Sarah Cohen, and actually Mary Francis, who's no longer with the press, but was the editor who brought the book. And actually was Michelle introduced me to Mary and really championed the book before, or the dissertation before it was even finished. And so it's been a real pleasure working with everyone at Michigan. And, but yeah, that gets to, sort of what led me to doing the research. I mean, it really was a class I took with Michelle. A lot of things that I was learning with Michelle and Jeremy Morris and Jonathan Gray and other folks who, professors at UW-Madison. But, particularly working with Michelle and really, focused my interest in doing sound studies. I had always had an interest in doing in sound media. I'd worked in music, in the music industry for many years before going back to school. So, although when I went back first to go to graduate school for my master's and then the PhD, I actually turned my interest more to television. And so I sort of had to come back to sound, and that's really where I took an interest in radio. And I always was from the very beginning, curious about, the convergence of the internet and radio and internet and sound media more generally. And sort of, I really have always been intrigued by those sort of moments of the new or the emerging, and particularly in what the book really is a cultural history, is the way that is taken up socially and politically, how people respond, the discourses that surround newness, and why people decide to pursue new technologies, and why in many cases, a lot of what I talk about, not a lot of, but some of what I talk about is failures too. So why some things succeed and other things don't, why some things get taken up widely and other things don't, or in the case of something like podcasting, had a fairly slow and gradual emergence. And so I really, initially though, Michelle, you had the Radio and the Art of Sound course. I remember, I think the first bits of the book were actually written, one piece that I wrote about Radiolab, and that was really looking at kind of the sound aesthetics of Radiolab, and that's always been an interest of, particularly in audio documentary, and is the use of sound and structure and narrative. And, but also then I started focusing on some of the bigger pieces of kind of theory that were the groundwork of the book. First I was focusing, I don't think I was really too focused on podcasting initially, that came a little later. It really was just internet radio, and what were the differences and the similarities between listening to radio online and listening to radio, to quote unquote terrestrial radio, which I love, is always one of those great, acronyms or whatever that we now call it terrestrial radio. But yeah, it was to look at, really one of the thrusts of the books is sort of, like how is it that we understand radio that's gone through all of these, over a century, many different technologies, many different formats. And now it's on the internet, including through podcasting. What's the through lines there? What are some of the things that make it similar? And I really, in the book, I talk more about this idea of sort of sociability. I think it's the social function of radio, the way that, why people turn to make radio, but also why listeners turn to listen to radio, and the kind of how we use it in our daily lives and that sort of experience of radio. And then beyond that, though, when I started really getting into the thinking about the history, the big issue really that maybe it took me a little time to realize it, because again, I started working on it, at least pieces of it, again, that must have been back in like 2014. And it took a couple of years to really start to come together as the dissertation, and then of course another few years as the book. But it was, just how little of that, of the history of radio on the internet, starting back in the early 90s, was the first form of streaming audio online was radio. Of course, now we think of streaming audio, I tend to think of music, and I do get to music streaming services a little in the book. But looking at that kind of progression, and then of course podcasting in like the early 2000s, and it was just how little that was known. Like there was no one had really written about it, at least certainly in the academic field, and really there weren't really any popular histories either. I mean, there was some newspaper reporting and things at the time, but even that, in some cases, like with the case of I think something that we might end up talking about more, is the first sort of streaming simulcast radio, so the taking broadcast radio feeds and sending them out live over the internet. That was done by college radio stations in like 1994, 1995. Like there was hardly any reporting on it at the time in like popular newspapers and magazines or whatever. I mean, it's really just the people who were involved and some of the people who were listening to it at the time that remember it. And most of those people, it's not like they're still talking about it a lot, right? So it's mostly been lost to sort of history. So there's a big element of what I did, is that was just sort of trying to capture this and trying to sort of pull the different threads together, and document them, and look at, again, what were some of the motivations and the reactions at the time, that were driving people to play around with audio on the internet. It was not a given that would be a thing that would happen in like 1993, 1995. In fact, there were some people who really were against it, like computer scientists, people who were like, this is a waste of bandwidth. This is not what the internet's designed to do. But it really was the sort of birthplace of the internet as a popular medium, and that showed that there could be used for entertainment and for communication beyond just sort of scientific research and things like that. So.
Should we go? I don't know if anyone had any questions, but moving on. I mean, I wanted to ask you, while we're still on, like, doing new history, doing a history of something that has not been explored. Are there any particular, you had to kind of, identify and create the archive that you'd be looking at as you went along. And if they weren't if your archive was not in all the usual places, in libraries and, in past research, you had to find it. And are there any things that you found that you think would be particularly interesting to, talk about, that people might enjoy knowing about, where they could, go and hear or find out about something that you covered in your book?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It was both exciting and incredibly frustrating to do this kind of research. And I'm not the first, there's many folks who do internet history and digital history have dealt with various problems of the lack of permanency. We think that the internet that everything on the internet is, well, that everything is on the internet. And then we think that everything, there's this sort of misconception amongst many people that, that it's all there and it's all there sort of permanently. And it's quite the opposite. It's an incredibly impermanent and imprecise medium, as wonderful as it is. I mean, it certainly does give us great access to information, but it's kind of here today, gone tomorrow. A lot of it, so it comes out of a few different things though, because also then I'm dealing with sound. And so sound has its own problems when it comes to of ephemerality and its sort of evasion of capture and documentation in archives and things for a whole various, some of them, sort of cultural reasons and taste biases and things, but others just being the difficulty of recording, of saving it. So with internet research, for instance, I certainly did use the Internet Archive and the Wayback Machine, which many people be familiar with, which archives old websites, or our kind of archive. The thing is that it has to capture them in the present, and it's basically a patchwork. It's not like it's capturing all the internet all the time. So going back, it would have, when I was doing research and say I needed to access some college radio station's website, they might have, like in a whole year, they might have a few captures of the website. And often it might just be like the homepage though, right? It doesn't necessarily capture the whole website. And often it might capture the text and even some of the images, but the audio would be like a dead link. So the audio is not there. So how do you find those things? And in some cases, people, a lot of it's turning to individuals. So never was my really intention to do oral history, and I still have, as many researchers would, there's certain issues of subjectivity and things that you don't want to be, that it can be, difficult, relying only on particularly the 30-year-old memories of the people who are involved, right? You want to have primary documents whenever possible. But I would use, interviews and things to fill in, or I would try to reach out to people to see if they had saved things, because a lot of these early, like internet radio stations or people who were building early streaming technologies, this was the era of like the .com boom, right? So they had a lot of companies would come out with a new technology, like the early podcasting, these ideas of audio blogging, and they'd be around for maybe a year, maybe 2 years, and then they'd either go out of business, as so many of those internet.com companies just sort of ran out of money really quick. They never really were profitable. So they went bust and then sort of disappeared. Or in some cases they got acquired, but they would get acquired by a big company like Yahoo. And sometimes the companies that got acquired by have since gone out of business, or they're so big that it's like they don't have open archives. And so it's difficult to go to them. So what I would end up having to rely on if I couldn't get to the individuals and ask them personally, which was actually, more a rarity than anything, would be things like press releases. So, from the time, at least that's really good for studying the way that they're sort of discursively positioning themselves. It's good for dates and things like that too, verifying dates of when a product was introduced or whatever. I found one thing that I found to be really useful were SEC documents, Securities Exchange documents, at least certainly with bigger companies when they, so for instance, I talk about, AudioNet, which became broadcast.com, which was Mark Cuban's company, that got sold to Yahoo for over $1 billion. And so when the company goes public, they have to file all this stuff with the SEC, and that's all public record stuff, right? So this is stuff that's public record. It's pretty well documented, and it's just packed with information. Now, of course, there's a lot of sort of rhetorical positioning happening, but at the same time, it's also the SEC, so they can't, they might fudge a little, but they can't outright lie, because that they could go to jail for that too. So you can take it. There's a certain level of kind of veracity to that, at least if you can kind of triangulate it with other things. But that's what I would have to do, right? Is so trying to pick up all these little breadcrumb trails of press releases and newspaper and magazine articles written at a time. Sometimes blogs and discussion forums. It'd be kind of with again, a lot of the a lot of what I talk about is when you're, at least when you're talking about these first, would be like internet technology. So people are building apps or building, new audio file formats or whatever. They were very active online. Of course, again, a lot of that stuff is not well recorded, but sometimes these communities would preserve it. You can find like old Google forums and things. So that would be, a good resource of when they were actually like, basically, it's kind of like the version of, if we were talking about like 1930s radio, like an internal memo, right? They'd be sort of sharing these, in these forums and these sort of white paper things. They'd be sharing, how the technology works, what are the problems they're trying to solve, and so on. So it was there's probably some others that I'm not thinking of. I mean, in a few cases I did have turned to traditional archives, but and there were some archivists, like I talked a good bit about WNYC, which is the New York City Public Radio Station, and Andy Lancet there, who's their archivist, was a great help. In the end, the areas that I was looking at actually had not very much saved. Late 1990s, early 2000, I was particularly interested in the development of their first websites and things like that, the first programs that they put online and that they put out as podcasts. And it was like, mostly just getting their sort of schedules and their program guides and things. But those weren't otherwise available. But they had them in their kind of internal archive, and he was willing to share them. And in some cases with colleges and universities, like with the college radio stations, I would go to the library and archive at University of Kansas, but they'd maybe have like a folder of mostly just press clippings, and you'd think that these colleges, that would be collecting, records from the college radio station and these other sort of clubs and institutions within, but they often weren't. There wasn't a formal kind of deposit procedure for like the college radio station to turn over their paperwork at the end of the year or anything like that. And I think anyone involved with college radio kind of knows that too. And of course, college radio turns over every year or two, the student leadership. And so the sort of memory within the institution can often be very poor. A new group of students come in and they just sort of throw in the trash the stuff that the group of students had saved before because they didn't think it was valuable. They just didn't know, they just don't have the time and the resources. So again, that's where I would maybe have to turn to trying to find the people who were like the general manager of the radio station in like 1996 and just sort of ask them, like, what do you remember? Oh, did you save anything? Like, do you have an old laptop somewhere maybe? Like, it was having to really piece together a personal archive essentially in a way.
And hopefully you'll be able to donate some of that to an archive someday, or well, never mind. We can leave that discussion for another time.
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I probably should, I'll just add one more thing is like one thing that I talk about in the book. The first internet radio station was called the Internet Multicasting Service, and they had a program called Geek of the Week and a channel called Internet Talk Radio. It was run by a guy named Carl Malamud. It started in 1993 in Washington, D.C. And one of the things that was just so valuable was that Malamud's like, runs an organization called publicresource.org, and he's a real sort of open records sort of public information guy. And like he fights to have laws that are often kind of kept in paid databases made public to the for free. So he's sort of this really kind of crusader for free and open information. And he put all of his sort of like whatever paper he had. I mean, he must have stopped. It must have been 10 years later or something. He went through all his personal records and scanned them, but he put them all online. And then eventually now they're on the Internet Archive. I can't tell you how valuable that was to me that he did that, because I was able to go through and find all of his like promotional materials and even some memos and like letters that he was writing to people, trying to get them to invest in this nonprofit project that he was doing. And so, yeah, I think, nowadays, why can't more researchers like myself, put up, that research on Internet Archive or on our personal websites or something to make them more publicly available. That's something that we probably should be thinking about more.
Yeah.
We do have a poll going up. Is podcasting radio, which we're voting on. So far, over half are saying yes, and then the remaining votes are split between no and unsure. I'll give a little more time to see if more of our attendees respond. We've got about 2/3 response rate so far. because this really is a question that I know leads into a key topic for your book. Got another vote for yes, podcasting is radio.
It's a hot issue of debate.
Some people feel very strongly about that.
I don't know what Michelle's answer is.
Oh, you do know.
I mean, I think I know. I suppose I haven't asked you that question in a while. Maybe you've changed your mind.
I think podcasting is a radio's dream come true. It's what radio always wanted to be. But then I always take I've been, by more pessimistic people pointed out, I tend to always be on the optimistic side. Whereas there have been people, and maybe you could talk about this, who are, very adamant that podcasting is not radio, that there are such significant differences that, we really shouldn't think of them as the same thing at all. And I'll just add one little thing. I don't know if anybody else read the article in the New York Times this morning that New York Times has just purchased a Serial company, the people who, produce Serial and other podcasts, which is an interesting, branch for, they're not a radio company, they're a news and publishing company. So I throw that out there as something to help us think about this question.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can maybe come around to that topic a little later. I mean, it's literally breaking news, but yeah, I was reading that last night before I went to bed, and then a little more this morning, and I definitely have some thoughts about that. But yeah, no, the question of is podcasting radio, I think I already mentioned a little bit before, but I mean, to me, it's a big yes. But I do get into sort of debates with people about this all the time. And, I've started to sort of, want to get away from like a really strict ontology or typology of like, what defines a medium. But I think like Michelle, I try to be optimistic. I want to kind of create a really big tent that we could put audio, various forms of audio that are radio or radio-like under. And so I think podcasting definitely does fit in that. But a big theme of the book, without getting into tons of detail of the more theoretical argument there, a big point of the book is sort of how do you define a medium, and radio itself has gone through so many changes, and there's very many different types of radio, and I think mostly when we say radio nowadays we think about broadcast radio, and particularly a more commercialized, at least in the United States, form of an institutionalized form of radio, but of course radio started out as a point-to-point medium, or rather a two-way medium, so, everyone was both a broadcaster and an audience member or listener. Maybe what we think of more as like ham radio today. And of course, we still have ham radio. We have these different types of radio, and they all kind of coexist. We mainly end up just talking about this sort of one sort of institutionalized form of more commercialized, broadcast radio. But even within that, there's, I've already been talking about college radio. I mean, college and community radio are so different from top 40 hit music radio, or even NPR sort of style public radio. And so when you think about podcasts, so it's really it's more than just one thing. It's not just about programming. It's not just about ownership and economics or your legal regulations. It's about audience. It's about producers. It's about aesthetics. And these definitions of radio have always been kind of evolving. And so I think when you look at kind of what I like to call the sort of the measure of the medium, what is the thing that, a lot of times people like, they look at radio, and if they want to see radio and podcasting are different from one another, they're really just talking about the technology, right? Like, oh, podcasting is RSS feeds and, whatever. That's why it's its own thing. But I'm like, yeah, but the way that we listen to it, most of us hear it and we think it's radio, right? And a lot of people even who do podcasting and you only do podcasting will still talk about it as like doing radio, like they sort of understand what it is because they've grown up listening to radio or whatever. And yeah, now it's this time shifted format, and there certainly are differences between a podcast and a radio program in terms of like length and structure and some of those things, but it's informed by radio. When you think about Serial, and I'll kind of end on this way. And think about Serial, and the probably the most famous podcast that we've had yet. Certainly very influential in the evolution of the form, or what I call in the book the practice of podcasting. Everyone who worked on that came out of radio. And not just like distantly came out of radio. I mean, like we're also actively working on This American Life, which is the radio program, even if a lot of people think of it as a podcast. still is, you know, a radio program. And then, you know, we're working on Serial. So, I mean, everything that they're putting into Serial, all of the DNA of Serial is in radio. And yeah, there's some things about sort of the long form serialized storytelling that they're doing there that is fairly unique. But I mean, Michelle will be the first to tell you, of course, serialization is might not be common in modern radio today, but certainly was historically a big part of radio. So, you know, and that's why I think, you know, if you look at the whole picture, you look at the historical context, you look at the technology, the economic structure, the regulatory structure, the aesthetics, the form, the way we listen to it, you know, there's so many similarities that I think that what's the point of trying to divorce them? We only lose if we divorce, you know, radio from podcasting or podcasting from radio. We lose the history, we lose the knowledge that can you know, that can help further the medium of podcasting. So again, I'm going to kind of put it all under one tent. Yeah, we can talk about differences. But I think that they deserve to be and are sort of inherently, you know, from the fruit of the same tree kind of thing.
Well said, in my opinion.
Thanks.
We'll see if we get any debate. Some people voted no on that, correct? Radio podcast. Well, interesting.
They're firm RSS believers. I don't know. I know. I won't go into why they said. I understand a lot of, and I'll accept some of the points, but again, I think if it usually ends up becoming monofocused on sort of like one thing, like something technological.
Now, you had mentioned college radio as being and that's a particularly interesting chapter, I think, in your book. Do we want to move on to that slide? And oops, we have another poll. There we go.
Oh, there we are. Yeah,
it's so interesting.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I just was going to say, I think if we look at, you're looking at SEC offerings, and that's obviously the big money side, especially the technology side of the story. But when you look again at the other side, you have people, you know, college radio stations, public radio, places that you don't associate with big money, but something else that are innovators in this field. So I think just want to hear what you have to say about that.
Yeah. So the book, I mean, the book for the folks who are new to it and you know, and aren't fully aware of it. The book is a cultural history of internet radio. I use that term internet radio. I think for a lot of people is sort of an aged term or sort of an outmoded term, but for reasons that I'm just sort of describing here, I mean, there's many different forms, right? So I don't want to just say it's about podcasting, because it's not just about podcasting, and it's not only about streaming audio, even if a lot of how we experience like internet radio says streaming audio or whatever. So it's not just about music, it's not just about talk and news radio, it's actually about all those things. The book is really broad. But by cultural history, really the big kind of questions that are driving the book is sort of like how and when did radio emerge on the internet, and then through its different kind of forms, you know, starting with, you know, starting with internet radio as we would think of just sort of streaming online radio. Some of it terrestrial radio that was then sort of shifted over to the internet, some of it which was sort of born and internet only, sort of native to the internet, and then things like podcasting. But really, like once, you know, so a lot of the book is looking at those different sort of points of initial emergence of sort of new technologies and new forms, and really kind of, you know, doing deep dives on those. But then more generally, the question of sort of why, right? So cultural history, like what was going on in the culture? What was the purpose? What are people trying to achieve by putting internet radio on the internet? It's not just a business history. It's not just a technological history, even if those elements are there. So what I think is really, you know, interesting about the college stations, and this is an early chapter in the book. It wasn't the first radio on the internet. Again, that was 1993 and Carl Malamud and the Internet Multicasting Service. I mean, there were some sort of experiments in the computer, the computer technology community with streaming audio before that, but it was very limited. It was mostly just sort of putting conference proceedings live online. You know, and so the first sort of thing that I think we could really recognize and understand as radio would be Internet Multicasting Service. But that was actually initially, just super quick history here, the first basically year or two of that. So from like 93 to 94, it really wasn't till early 95 that they started doing sort of regular live streaming. There were a few instances of doing sort of live streaming with the Internet Multicasting Service, but only really for special events. like in 93, 94. They were using something called the multicasting backbone, the M-bone, which is the sort of specialized technology that wasn't open to most people. And but the first real sort of what we would think of as internet radio streaming over the internet came from these college stations. And so it's just sort of the mid tail end of 1994. And what I think makes it a great story is, again, actually just like internet multicasting service, and then like a number of the early players I talk about in the book, the sort of early adopters, if you will, of internet radio, they mostly didn't have much to do with radio at all. They weren't coming from the mainstream, certainly not from the commercial mainstream of the radio industry. They were coming from outside. And so, because Malamud didn't have a background in radio, he was an internet guy. Basically, he was a computer technology guy who was using radio as a way actually to help basically kind of teach people about the internet and try to basically popularize the internet, which it was actually quite successful in doing. And because this is the early years of the web, by the way. The World Wide Web starts around 1990, but doesn't really start to become mainstream until like 93, 94. And so this is really that moment when most average people who weren't scientists, who weren't researchers, who weren't working at a college or whatever, were first sort of like, what is the internet? Maybe a lot of you have seen that, like, you know, that classic Today Show clip with like Katie Couric and Brian Gumbel, and they're like, what is internet anyway, right? You know, they're sort of really intelligent people, right? Most people are like, have not encountered this, or they've sort of vaguely heard of it, but they don't really understand it yet. But here you have a case of radio on the internet. It's really early, and I think it's a great example because while there are these college stations, right? College radio stations are sort of wonderful. I mean, I work at a college and I advise the college radio station, and I did college radio at UW-Madison when I was there. I love college radio. College radio stations are weird places, you know. They're you know, these rather, in many cases, I mean, there's a whole range of college radio stations, some very, very professionalized, and others, like, you know, are basically like a room in a basement, and it looks like, you know, somebody's like electrical hobby shop or whatever, you know, it's very kind of hacked together. So there's a whole range, but the point is that, like, in most cases, the college radio station is pretty well established. They have good equipment, they have FM licenses or AM licenses, and you know, they're real radio stations, but they're not profit motive, right? They're nonprofit because they're at colleges. They're meant to be educational. Like I said, the nature of them is that the students come and go every year. And so, you know, you have sort of kids who are like learning for the first time, like how to do radio, and they're like learning all in the air. I don't know if anyone listens to a lot of college radio. It can be really great, and it can be like really horrible. I mean, I've listened to, like, you know, students that like, they'll talk to their mom on the phone for like 20 minutes. And it's like, you know, listening to like literally someone's conversation with their mom, and like broadcast over the air. You know, I mean, there's like sort of very little, often not a lot. It's not very formatted, right? It's free form. But there's, so what the point of that is that they're kind of these great like sandboxes, where kids are learning about radio. They have the equipment and the technology, and they have the support to just sort of do it. And there's very little, often there's not many people saying no. They're not heavily kind of regulated, at least in the day-to-day. Most of the time there's like a guy like me who's like a professor, like up on the other side of campus, who maybe comes down. I mean, I'm pretty hands-on with my students, but, you know, who I'm not paid to be at the radio station all day. My radio station at SUNY Oneonta, WNY, doesn't have a general manager who's on staff. I mean, some bigger schools, even like UW-Madison, do. But the point is that the students kind of can get away with a lot. And in many cases, they're student run, right? And that's the way they're structured. So students actually are the decision makers, and I'm the advisor. I just have to basically make sure that they're not like killing one another and spending money poorly or whatever. Like, that's my sort of my main job. I'm kind of kidding, but I'm not really.
I know.
And so, you know, so college radio stations, right, is the story here with these college radio stations. You have WXYC at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, WREK at Georgia Tech, Georgia Institute of Technology, and KGHK at University of Kansas Lawrence, or KU. What I think is a great story here is that all of these three, and there were other college stations too that came around not too much after them, we're all kind of working on the same idea more or less at once, independent from one another. So there's this idea of kind of multiple discovery, and that's in sort of science and technology studies, type of this idea of sort of when something is invented at the same time by different people kind of independently of one another, which really speaks to the idea that something was in the air, right? Like this idea was new and a number of people invented it, but like they all invented it at the same time. The technologies were slightly different from one another. Some work better than others. There's still an argument between them about who was first, and I'm not sure that I think WXYC was first, but they were all really close to one another. I'm not the kind of historian who's really big about nailing down firsts. I mean, it always comes out, that's what everyone wants to talk about. But I think what's interesting about this story is the idea that they were all kind of working on it at the same time. But it all came from a similar, every story at all three of these places was more or less the same, which is that you had someone who was involved, a student who was involved with the college radio station, who was, in most cases, they were computer science students. And so they were kind of learning about internet technology in the classroom, and that's what they were planning to do with their career. And they were also kind of at the radio station, and they were like, well, we could put the radio station on the internet. And then and there's literally like one of them, they tell me a story that they were like at a dinner with a few other like radio station members, and somebody was like, yeah, like let's do it. And then this is the great thing about college radio stations, no one said no. Like you have these 20-year-olds, 23-year-olds, like some of them were grad students, they get really excited about an idea. All they need is their intuition and their energy and their drive to do it. And so but like if you're at a commercial radio station, of course someone's going to be like, no, you need to be working on this other thing, or that's going to cost too much money. Don't do it. That's a waste of time. It's a waste of money. And even at bigger public radio stations, right, there weren't budgets for these things. There's a more risk-adverse atmosphere at those established institutions of radio. But at college radio stations, there was, it was just do it, right? WXYC, the reason why I think part of why they were first was that they had a lot of support. There was this thing called Sunsight, run by Sun Microsystems, that were these sort of, they were all over the world actually, but basically they're kind of like computer research institutions, and they were building databases and sort of archives and things online. And so they had one of these Sunsights, and there was a guy called Paul Jones who was a faculty member, computer science faculty member, who was helping run Sunsight. And so the Sunsight kind of graduate students who were working with Sunsight helped work with WXYC and to put it online. But it's all like really low tech. Like, I mean, at least, today we would think of it. And even then it wasn't like they were using super sophisticated technology. They were in many cases hacking together tools that were developed for other purposes, like including like actually what was like a early video conferencing tool to create these streaming technologies. And so I think the college stations are a great story there for a few reasons, just to sort of back it up again, this idea that it's people who are mostly coming from outside radio. Because again, college radio stations are, yeah, they're radio, but they're really kind of on the periphery of what we think of as a radio industry, at least. And then even the people at those college stations that were most involved with the internet streaming were mostly the ones, they were kind of on the periphery of the radio station in many cases. They were more like a computer science student who was kind of affiliated with the radio station, doing their kind of computer science thing and using the radio as a sort of platform to do it. In many cases, just because they wanted to learn more about the technology, or they wanted to do something cool. They wanted to, impress themselves, impress their friends, just sort of, that's that idea of like the hacker spirit, is just sort of trying to do something not for money, not for, anything other than just to sort of like, I have the skill, I want to push myself, I want to achieve something, so I'm just going to do it. I'm going to make it. It's like a DIY kind of thing. And then the other thing was that, was that spirit of kind of hacking together, and taking either technologies that already existed, but existed for other purposes, or technologies that were just sort of forming, and not necessarily like they were just sort of tweaking things. And kind of like, and that's what, if you think about it in a way, like internet radio initially was kind of a hack. It's like, there's this thing called the internet, and there's this thing called radio, like, let's put them together. I have sort of a joke about that in the intro of the book, because I won't get into Silicon Valley, some people know that. There's a whole joke about this really crass guy who made billions of dollars He's basically supposed to be Mark Cuban. And he's like, and I took this thing called the internet and this thing called radio, and nobody was doing it, right? And the idea is sort of like, you know, how sort of like silly an idea that is. But at the time, it actually was really exciting, and it was actually quite innovative technology. And then you have folks, you know, come along within a year, like Real Audio, Rob Glazer, and Progressive Networks, who invents the Real Audio streaming technology, who'll take not using these same tools, but using these same sort of principles, and put them in a form that was more easily commercialized. That really made the medium go mainstream. I mean, what these college students were doing was only ever maybe listened to by a few hundred people. It was relatively niche, but it did nevertheless help kind of spread the idea and also just sort of prove the point that it could be done. And I think that was a big part of it, what early kind of internet radio was about, was really just sort of the act of doing it, and it was really the invention.
Thank you, Andrew. We're gonna start up a poll to kind of see which additional case study people want to hear about. And we actually have 2 questions from the audience. So the first one, growing up in the UK, so much of the population would listen to one of the main BBC radio channels. It provided a consistent cultural reference point, and there was an element of a national conversation. With podcasting and internet radio and the fragmentation of the audience, have we lost something special?
I think that's a really excellent question. I'd almost be curious if you have an answer to that, Michelle.
Well, I was going to ask you, one of my questions I thought I threw is, you know, have we lost anything? You know, is there something that's been lost in this new digital exploding, you know, audio universe? And I think that sense of, of a shared, unified activity. I mean, when you think about not, you know, that British radio obviously had the BBC, you know, so prominent, and our situation in the US was a little different. But when you think about Norman Corwin, you know, airing his features, his famous We Hold These Truths and the one after the war, on all 3 networks, I mean, that's, you know, reaching the entire country simultaneously. You know, how could that even happen anymore? Or do you think there is an equivalent?
So I think, so no, there's no doubt, right, that we're in a fundamentally different media landscape in that way, and that's, you know, that's not unique to us in radio too. I mean, of course, television studies, you know, television has also gone from this shift from a network era to a post-network era, and narrowcasting and so on, and the loss of the mass audience, right, and then therefore you know, a loss of a lot of that commonality, and you know, you could think about it just in terms of you know, that we don't have many shared programs that we all listen to, and that, like, you know, I mean, that's certainly true of television, the way there's very few kind of water cooler shows, or whatever you want to call them, that you can rely on everyone. I mean, try teaching, I mean, yeah, I do it, right? A lot of us do it, teaching television in the year 2020. I mean, it's impossible to find, you know, even like 3 20-year-olds who all watch the same program, you know, I mean, let alone a classroom of 20 or 30, right? That's been the story for a number of, well, decades even now, but certainly a number of years, and it's only getting, you know, more and more fragmented. But you know, in same thing though, teaching radio, I mean, with podcasts and things, I mean, there's like, you know, there's always maybe a couple students who like listen to you know, to This American Life or Serial or something like that, and then there's maybe like a handful that listen to like Joe Rogan or something awful. And you know, but it's still, it's very difficult to find commonalities. You know, but we could talk about that more, you know, about a sense of a national consciousness or a cultural imaginary or whatever, you know, kind of an imagined community, right? Mr. Michel writes about so excellently in, you know, Radio Voices. And you know, that's I think unlikely in any media form, you know, in this day and age. You know, even things that we think of as being massively popular there's still going to be a large number of people that have never even heard of it before, right? But I think there are, you know, ways. So yeah, and certainly in the UK with the BBC and having a national broadcaster at a time when there were like only 3 networks, you know, and they were all, you know, BBC 1, 2, and 3 or whatever, you there's that's not going to happen. But I think there are ways, and we're seeing this, I think, increasingly, that there is a desire among particularly many younger people to find, some sort of commonalities or some cultural touch points and things. They want to have things in common with their friends and and their families and those around them. And they're looking to, we might all have our niche tastes, our particular tastes, but we have ways of seeking out others who share those interests, right? So, and that's why I talk in the book about, in terms of the sociability of radio. Radio has always been, and I think podcasting still is, a way of trying to connect with the outside world, right? That idea that, you think about tap listening in the radio, where you just sort of turn the radio on in the morning and you just sort of let it go in the background. And it's this idea, particularly if you're someone who's alone or relatively isolated, you think about people who might be, might be disabled or might be in a real rural location or whatever. You sort of turn on the radio as a way of sort of bringing the outside world to you when you're very, physically distanced from it. I think a lot of us feel in an era when we're kind of driven by our own sort of taste preferences, our own individual kind of our own individual likes. We often feel pretty isolated because, again, the people immediately in your household or in your dorm, or whatever, might not like the same things as you. But we can go online and we can find other folks who we can recreate that sense of a community or a culture around us. And so there's an idea of sharedness that I think is embedded in social media. And so I think we see that a way of, it might not be to the same level, not even maybe close to the same level as a national broadcaster, but we do find ways of kind of building a community of sort of shared interests through going online. And there's great, like, for instance, with podcasts, there's a number of great like Facebook groups for like podcast fans, and certainly with like particular shows, you can go on Reddit and there's going to be there's going to be a Reddit for subreddit for whatever Serial or Radiolab or whatever program you might be into. And so, and you can, and the great thing though that makes it, I think, even more interactive and more kind of multi-directional is, of course, with things like Twitter, Instagram, you can go and you can connect with the makers of the programs, right? So there's now more of a sense of dialogue between the audience and the producers that I think there ever was. Yes, there was fan mail and things like that, but 50, 60, 70 years ago. But today, you could I could send a tweet out, to Ira Glass, and maybe he's not going to respond, but there's that sense that like he's right there, right? At least he could possibly read it. He could, but he might very likely respond. And so there's that sense of that. Then there becomes, and that also then I think the nice thing about that one of the things with podcasting is that then we've lost the sort of the liveness of the broadcast, but it extends the life, and it kind of makes this sort of fixed episode of a podcast or whatever becomes something that can continually live on and be kind of experienced and re-experienced as it's discussed through social media and so then the liveness then becomes more about the sort of the cultural conversation and community that forms around the podcast than it is about anything in the technology of the podcast and the transmission, right? But it's still being shifted and it still exists in a way, or can at least potentially exist in a way.
Yeah. And then, so we do have our poll result and our Q&A. We are running a little close to time, but Andrew, Michelle, if you don't mind, Michelle and I are okay with running over a little bit. And anyone who has to cut out and leave early, the recording will be shared with you after, so you can get those last minutes. So I'm going to share both the open Q&A question that I have and then the poll results, and you can kind of tackle them as you wish. So the Q&A that we had come in was, radio drama used to be such a ubiquitous feature of radio, then it seemed to die off. Are you seeing a resurgence of dramatic productions in internet radio? And then...
Oh, definitely, yeah.
Yeah, and then, so the poll results share that people are interested in the development of podcasting a little bit more in detail. And then kind of just as I was talking, I had a final Q&A come in that kind of ties into that. So with the development of podcasting, anything you can answer about political content in podcasting and radio, love left-leaning political radio mostly failed, Air America, etc. There are a number of left and center-left political podcasts, Pod Save America, etc., that have been successful. How do you explain this disparity? So we're going to try to cover that in the final.
Yeah, well, I'll try to say. I mean, for the radio drama, one, I think that's a definite yes. And it just in that. I mean, in the book, I have a chapter that deals with radio drama, and also sort of nonfiction audio too. But I talk about Welcome to Night Vale, for instance, which was one of the by no means the first sort of podcast drama, but one of the first kind of breakout hits. And I'm forgetting the year now that even started, but I mean, we're talking about like 2012, 2013 or something like that. And so it's now feels like kind of ancient almost. It's still going though, right? And it has had a number of kind of spin-offs and things. And there's been many, many more since then. I'm sure they haven't maybe reached the huge popularity that radio dramas had in the so-called golden age of radio, in the 1930s, 40s, 50s. There is a proliferation of them. There seems to be more and more every day. They're also getting increasingly sort of artistically, aesthetically, deep and sort of really great production values, really good acting, really good writing. There's just I'll just point maybe people to the research of a guy named Neil Verma, who Michelle knows very well, who's at Northwestern University, and he's published quite widely on radio drama, but also podcasts and fiction, sort of fiction podcasting. So I think I'll just add there that, there's been a number of interesting articles that maybe some folks have seen and productions that some people maybe listen to during the COVID-19 pandemic, where a number of theater companies, some really big theater companies, including the Public Theater in New York City, are turning to audio drama as a way of trying to do something when they can't put on live theater. And so I think that's, maybe they're just sort of, traipsing in because they have nothing else to do, and they might not stay around. But I think they're learning pretty quickly that, radio drama is really difficult to produce well. It's not just an audio recording of a live theater presentation. It's its own unique format. But nevertheless, it's kind of exciting that I think more and more actors and performers from the stage, at least, and even some from radio and TV. I mean, of course, people have listened to probably like Homecoming, the Game It podcast, which had, professional actors like Catherine Keener and David Schwimmer and stuff. That more and more people are discovering it, both in the sort of, entertainment industries and also audiences. So I think we're only going to see that grow. In terms of the early history of podcasting, I guess I'll just say, what's and this maybe might I don't know if it'll get to Martin's question about politics, but I'll try to get there. What I look at in the book, I think the thing that is maybe surprising, again, going back to what was one of the things that was sort of driving the book, the early history of podcasting, and really what I talk about in terms of the early history of podcasting kind of stops where most people think it starts. And that's because what I discovered was that we really, don't know anything about the early history of podcasting. We didn't, before, in terms of what was normally reported, both in the press and often then sort of repeated in a lot of the radio studies and the sort of emerging field of podcast studies, literature about kind of when the medium started and who were the innovators in the medium. We usually start around late 2004, 2005, which is when 2005 is when podcasts were put into iTunes. And so that's when the sort of, and the word podcasting became kind of widely known. But really it had been growing, it had been developing, at least the sort of the roots of it had been developing since 2000, 2001. But it was called something different. It was called audio blogging. It was literally an audio form of blogging, essentially. It was very closely tied to blogging as a format and blogging as a technology. It used RSS feeds. But it was it was actually very different. You know, there were these things that the kind of case study in the book that I talk about most. And I talk a little bit about Dave Weiner, who's the guy who really was very influential in the development of RSS technology, which was first with blogging and then with audio feeds via RSS, which is what we think of as podcasting. And he was someone who was producing some content and also very closely associated with helping others who were doing audio content. Including like Adam Curry, who I think people will know as like an MTV VJ, who a lot of people credit as being kind of like the pod father, although really kind of he came around later. But the cool thing about the audio blogs was that a number of them were these sort of like phone to blog services. So people would have a blog and they'd want to record an audio version of their blog, which were often these relatively short audio messages. And but this was still like 2001, 2002, 2003, where people didn't have, most people didn't have good like audio, like recording technologies or way of getting audio onto the internet. So you would literally, it would be a service where you would call up on the phone, you would record your audio, and then the service would post your audio to your blog. It's this great convergence of internet technology and sort of radio sound technology, but also the telephone. It's a great moment. But one of those first, so I talk about a company called Oddblog, which is basically the story here is that it became a company called Odeo, which became Twitter. And so there's like, I think a great sort of, at least a shared kind of idea there about kind of communication in our social media age. And this idea of these sort of, they were these short audio messages that were sort of posted publicly. And the idea was that people actually were very dialogic, like that people would, one person would post an audio blog message and then another person would respond to it with their own audio blog message, and they'd be kind of back and forth. And it, it was happening through blogs though, not through a social media platform. But like it got taken up by Twitter, and actually Twitter, before they did SMS text as essentially the basis of what we think of as Twitter, the text tweet, they were prototyping doing it with audio. And of course the text version went out, but there are actually 3 prototypes that were the audio, and there's only 1 prototype that was text. So it was like Twitter came very close in like 2005, 2006 or whatever, to being like audio Twitter, which of course now, if you read the news, like they just added audio tweets like a couple months ago, like a month ago. And so they've kind of come back to their roots in a way, which is sort of an interesting way of history coming back around. But I think there's something about that idea of the form of communication there. It's very radio-like, of sort of talk radio and that kind of the back and forth. And it's a very kind of colloquial conversational talk. And yeah, I don't know if we have, do we have time to answer the politics question?
If you think you can do it in a couple of minutes, I think that's feasible.
You can explain all of that in a couple of minutes, can't you, Andrew?
Yeah, no, I mean, I guess I mean, maybe I don't have a strong opinion or it's not necessarily something that I focused on deeply. I mean, I think certainly, yeah, think about, I think it's interesting. I just don't really know if I have a whole lot to say about that. I mean, we think about like sort of political talk radio, particularly in the 80s or beginning in the 80s and then through the 90s, and with Rush Limbaugh and sort of that right-wing talk, very influential on, the development of the radio industry and radio talk as a sort of form in the last sort of 25 plus years. But it is really interesting that like leftist or sort of liberal talk radio really never was able to succeed. I mean, people might remember Air America in the early 2000s, which interestingly was primarily the largest investor in Air America was Rob Glazer, who was the guy who invented real audio. He wanted to do a progressive sort of talk sort of video or radio thing, but he couldn't really kind of make it work in the 90s. So he ended up doing real audio. And but yeah, it wasn't able to succeed then. Of course, like Air America gave us Mark Maron, though. That was where Mark Maron really got his start. And of course, now one of the most, famous podcasters. I don't know. I think I lost my train of thought on that question though. I think it was about time that somebody was able to do kind of liberal talk radio. I mean, why? And I think, I think a lot of it is though, there's a longer discussion to be had about maybe sort of taking up some of the lessons of right-wing talk radio and sort of trying to adapt them to a different audience. And they finally are able to do it with things like Pods of America.
And of course, there's the way that the digital audio has opened up to all kinds of political and social and cultural points of view. There certainly are far more women, people of color, that are able to, that are active and have a wider audience. That's one thing that strikes me about the contrast with radio. So, but that's a whole other thing. And I guess that'll be another book, perhaps.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you very much to both Andrew and Michelle for everything today. And Sean here is going to wrap up with a little bit about where you can get her book.
Yes, thank you so much to Andrew and Michelle and for everyone who has attended this session. You can pick up a copy of Sound Streams on our website, press.umich.edu for 30% off using code UMStreamsVA. And Teresa, if you can advance to the next slide as well. We also encourage you to support your local bookstores. Shops like Bookbound and Literati in Ann Arbor, as well as Nicholas, have presences on bookshop.org if you're familiar with that site. And Andrew has provided a Green Toad bookstore in New York. And as another reminder, this book is currently free to read until August 31st on Fulcrum. I've dropped a direct link in the chat, but you can see all of our selection at fulcrum.org/Michigan. Thank you all for attending.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.